Hey, this is Warren Redlick. I'm here with Peter Hague. I follow Peter on Twitter. He talks about space a lot. He's very knowledgeable. And so we're going to talk about Mars. We're going to talk about getting to Mars, getting home from Mars, and also what life is going to be like on Mars and what we need to do or what humanity needs to do to make Mars as a colony viable. Are you ready? Let's go. So, Peter, would you please tell my audience a bit about your background?
Well, as you can probably tell, I'm from the UK. My background's in astrophysics. I did my physics undergraduate and PhD at the University of Leicester, where I also participated in a student CubeSat project and a high altitude balloon project. Unfortunately, neither of them got off the ground. I've also done postdoc work at Durham University in the Cavendish Lab at Cambridge. My day job at the moment is I'm a scientific software engineer, so I do kind of data pipelines, image processing for other scientists. And at the same time, I write the Planetocracy newsletter. So I'm kind of advocating for general human expansion to space. Bit of a focus on Mars, but not completely.
And how do you differentiate Planetocracy from, say, the Mars Society? Are they work together? They're different?
Now, there's a chapter of the Mars Society in the UK. I've been to one of their meetings. There's not actually that great deal of advocacy work going on in the UK for this sort of thing. I mean, this is sort of my kind of personal sort of education and outreach project. So it's not affiliated with Mars Society or anything else like that. And also, I've sort of take a bit of a broader view. It's not just about Mars. It's about the basic sort of starting point is the fact that as the sun emits light in all directions, for every photon of light that strikes the Earth, about 2 billion miss it. So we are utilizing this sort of immense fusion reactor at the center of our solar system, only 1 part in 2 billion. And we don't need to increase that utilization by much to vastly improve the capabilities of the human species. And like if we used, say, only 1 part in 1,000 of the sun's output in the long term, we'd still increase our output by a factor of 2 million. So that would support 16 trillion humans, each with a per capita energy consumption 1,000 times higher than present. And that includes the energy required to run the biosphere to support you. So that, to me, is sort of the guiding light of why we have to go out into space. And that's what I write about in the newsletter.
Well, what you're describing sounds a little bit like the Kardashev Scale.
Yes, that's exactly.
Rather than me butchering what the Kardashev Scale is, could you explain it to the audience?
Yeah, it was a Russian astrophysicist called Nikolai Kardashev. I think it was in 1964, mid 60s. I think he wrote a paper where he classified potential extraterrestrial civilizations into three distinct classes. The first would be type 1, would be one that utilized all the energy of a single planet. Type 2 would be utilized all the energy of a star, and type 3 would utilize all the energy of a galaxy. And originally he had this in mind, just 3 distinct types. Later on noticed that you could fit, there's roughly 10 orders of magnitude between each of these. So you could put a log scale straight line between the 3. So you could have a continuous scale. And on this, some people have sort of looked at energy consumption and said like 0.7 or 0.8, we're moving towards 1. But personally, obviously, when we move out to space, once you move to type 2, you've basically surrounded your star and you're using all of its energy. Personally, I don't think that values of the Kardashev scale below 1 are that meaningful because it's hard to say what energy we're using, because they're normally people do it on our industrial energy, but most of the energy we use is actually sunlight falling on agricultural land. And also, let's say some sunlight falls on the Brazilian rainforest. We're not using it per se, but to the extent that, depending on which government's in power in Brazil, we're protecting that rainforest, we are making a choice to not like log it or anything. So we are using that energy to sort of permit the existence of a biosphere that we like. So that's a bit rambling, but that's basic idea. It's about energy use and sort of how we can go beyond just the energy available on one planet and vastly expand. Like I said, it's about 2 billion fold from the energy that falls on the Earth to all the energy available from the sun.
The idea, I think, basically is that we could put satellites in orbit, let's say, that collect solar energy in orbit around the sun, that collect a larger amount of solar energy than the energy we're collecting now. And there's some fantastical ideas, like there's a book by Niven called Ring World, where some ancient civilization had built a ring around their star, and there's another
I've read that one.
Concept called the Dyson Sphere, I think, where you enclose your star in a sphere.
That's a Dyson shell, technically. Freeman Dyson, actually, I think this published this before Kardashev, but he sort of hypothesized about surrounding your entire star with collectors. It's not clear in his original paper. He later claimed, he wasn't talking about a shell, because for physics reasons, a solid shell around a star, it would not feel any gravitational attraction from the star. So essentially the star could just drift into it. But yeah, it's the basic concept. Although that's sort of quite far in the future. And I do make the point that, I mean, it's a good sort of thing to aim for. We have to sort of think where we can start out. And the most likely place we can start out is the surface of Mars.
Right. I mean, I think the idea is that sometime in the future, humanity may have reached or the AI that follows us will have reached the ability to accomplish something like that. But for now, it's like, well, okay, we've got the sunlight falling on this planet. We can also capture, let's say, the sunlight falling on the moon and the sunlight falling on Mars. And maybe we can create ONeill colonies, Jeff Bezos ONeill colonies, to capture some more. And ultimately, at some point, we can, the measure of a civilization to some extent is the extent to which it uses the energy, and the extent to which it uses energy. So the more energy you can capture and use efficiently, the more you can do with your civilization.
Yeah, I mean, it's sort of not the be all end all. We can't sort of to sort of just pick this sort of material target and just drive towards it. It's a bit Soviet, I guess, but it's more that it's the requirement to be able to do other interesting stuff. Like every human activity has an energy content. When you sort of you pay money for some goods or services, you're either more or less directly buying energy, if it's like sort of food or if it's fuel, or if it's a service, then somebody's getting paid and they're using their pay to buy food and so on. And if you sort of trace a dollar or a pound or euro through the economy long enough, it'll always hit energy. So,
right. Well, there's this thing that I see, that the way a lot of people think about humanity and Earth is that there's this sort of roughly a zero-sum game, and the Russians are trying to take resources from Ukraine, and Ukraine's trying to protect their resources, and we're trying to take resources from the Middle East or whatever, and there's this endless battle over dirt and whatever's in the dirt and or whatever's on top of the dirt here on Earth. And you and I see something, and I think Elon Musk sees something, and others see that it's not a zero-sum game. That if, like, this is a pitch that I make, if we could get past this petty fight over dirt, and we could say, you're describing, instead of thinking about a zero-sum game, we can think about a 2 billion X game.
Yeah.
Like, we can grow civilization 2 billion X, and there's plenty for everybody if we work together to expand into space, to capture more energy from the sun, to grow humanity instead of being terrified that, we're destroying the planet.
Yeah, I mean, that's the idea. I mean, the issue is how long it'll take, though, because there's going to be a period where I think I wrote one of the I read about this in the newsletter, is that we've basically got ourselves in a bit of a pickle at the moment as a civilization, because we essentially abandoned interplanetary travel after 1972, the last Apollo mission, which is, I think that was the anniversary of that today, Apollo 17. We basically gave up on that and said we're not expanding into space. We'll just send probes out. We're not going to send people beyond low Earth orbit. So we had this 50-year delay we didn't need to have. And at the same time, we've made some bad choices with energy, like notably with nuclear power, but also with sort of slow walking renewables. And I mean, and given the context of what's happening with Russian gas at the moment, it's sort of fairly obvious to most people now that we've not handled that well. So, and a few other things, but we want to get to the future where we can sort of reasonably easily move people off Earth to sort of improve their lives and sort of build something in space. But we have to sort of manage our own planet until we can do that at scale.
Right.
And yeah, some various bad decisions have made that gap longer than it had to be.
Yeah, on the bright side, it seems like Elon Musk, and maybe to a lesser extent Rocket Lab, Elon Musk and SpaceX, and to a lesser extent Rocket Lab and Ad Astra and maybe Blue Origin are making progress at getting launch costs much lower, which makes interplanetary travel much more viable.
Yeah.
Right. So
primarily SpaceX at the moment.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I think there's some promise with Rocket Lab. There's some promise with Ad Astra. We're all wondering when Blue Origin's going to do something. But okay. So with that in mind, we are expecting that SpaceX Starship is going to lower the cost to low Earth orbit from what was about $10,000 a kilogram to low Earth orbit on the space shuttle to maybe $50 a kilogram, or even $20 or $10 a kilogram.
I think it was like 50,000 on the space shuttle. Is really expensive.
Right.
Yeah, it's getting down to like, well, Musk says it'll do $2 million a flight. His numbers are basically, if you look at the market price of the liquefied gas in them, it's about $1 million worth.
Yeah, I think he said $900,000, but maybe the price has fluctuated a little bit.
Yeah. He may be able to get it a little bit cheaper if he's manufacturing the methane on site. He can sort of like streamline it, vertically integrate it, because he's good at this sort of thing. But yeah, roughly speaking, about $1 million of propellant in it, and he's saying we double the cost, and that's the cost per flight.
Right. I wonder.
I'm not sure.
Go ahead.
I think that's a bit of an ambitious target. I think. Well, the way I see it, I think the cost of manufacturing the Falcon 9 second stage is about $20 million. So I can't, if he's not manufacturing anything per flight, if it's fully reusable, it shouldn't cost more than that. It'll cost more than Elon says. So I tend to sort of, my guess is it'll be about $10 million per flight, which is still revolutionary because of how much we can carry.
Yeah, maybe it's $100 a kilogram to low Earth orbit instead of 10,000 or 50,000.
Yeah.
And this enables the potential to carry large payloads to Mars, including humans. And I think there was a number that it would be like $200,000 to get a human to Mars on the Starship platform. When you do a lot of humans, $200,000 a person. And I came up with this number that it would be, if you wanted to get 1 million people to Mars, if it's $200,000 a piece, then it would be $200 billion to get 1 million people to Mars. And then figure you're going to spend 4 times as much as that on payload, on cargo. So you're talking about $1 trillion expense to get 1 million people to Mars.
Yeah.
And in my theory, Elon becomes a 5 trillionaire or 10 trillionaire, and he just writes the check, because you can't count on governments to write those checks.
Yeah.
Because they don't see politically, it's just not viable.
Yeah, I think the fact, I sometimes worry that anybody advocating for space colonies kind of shoots himself in the foot a bit with government. And I'm guilty of this too, because everyone's quite sort of clearly expressing the intent that they would like to be able to self-govern in space, which immediately, from like governments which tend to like they like running things, they like governing. They think, well, why the hell should we pay for this? Because you're just going to take the money and go away and never come back and not pay us back. So yeah, I mean, as I say, it's going to cost hundreds of billions just to get the people there, even at the low prices. I mean, they are going to be paying individually, so there's not necessarily need to be anybody to write the like $200 billion check. And as for cargo, there will be some cargo that goes with them on the Starships, because the Musk sort of baseline plan for this is you're going to launch a Starship with, he says 100 people on it, but that'd be pretty cramped. So maybe 50 to 100 people. And it's going to have 8, 9, 10 tankers visited and fill it with fuel. And that's going to fly off to Mars. And they're going to do like a flotilla of these. So you can all fly in like a big, fairly close formation. So if anything goes wrong in one Starship, they can help each other out. I think that's the idea. There will also be some cargo Starships landed first, but so each Starship will have the stuff that group needs to survive for the journey and possibly after they've landed, because the Starships are decent size and you can use it as a habitat once you've landed. I know it does depend how much money Elon ends up with, I guess. Maybe he'll sell off Tesla, because if he's going to be leaving the planet, considering he doesn't like people working from home in the same city, I doubt he's going to want to manage a company from another planet.
Right. Yeah, I think the vision is that you're going to get 100 people to Mars and you're going to start establishing a colony, the infrastructure of a colony, and then you're going to get a couple thousand people to Mars. And for those who don't know, I think you can correct me if I'm wrong, that you don't typically have you can't just go anytime. Mars and Earth are orbiting the sun, going around, and when they're near each other, it's easy to make the trip, but half the time they're far apart and you can't really make the trip.
Yeah, every 26 months, really, you get a decent window.
So the vision is the vision is once you're flying, making trips to Mars in volume, you've got, 100,000 people go. You fly 100 ships with 1,000 people each, or 1,000 ships with 100 people each every 2 years, and it takes you 20 years because it's every 26 months or a little more than 20 years to get 1 million people there. And this all sounds like out there dystopian science fiction to say we're going to send 100,000 people to Mars in one shot. But I think initially it's, you get 10 people there, then we get 100 people there, then we get 1,000 people there. And at some point you have enough infrastructure that Elon feels like it's time for him to go. But I don't think he goes that quickly. I think he needs to organize the effort on Earth to get people there.
Like I say, he's got the whole sort of sleeping on the factory floor mentality.
Yeah.
I think it depends. If by the time the Starship is flying regularly, he may sort of feel he can hand off SpaceX to somebody else.
Right.
Maybe like Gwynne Shotwell, who's already the president, I think, of the company.
Sure.
Because he will probably want to be directly involved with the establishment of the colony.
Yeah. I think Gwynne wants to go to. I think Gwynne wants to go to Mars, though. They'll find somebody to run it.
Yeah.
I'm pretty sure Gwynne wants to go.
The thing is with Elon, I think he's got. It's almost a problem with him that he doesn't. I don't think there's many people he's willing to delegate to.
Right.
This is how he ended up with Twitter. He doesn't seem to sort of trust that anything important is going to be done properly by other people. So there's currently some issues at SpaceX with a couple of Falcon 9s that had their flights delayed, just like to inspect the rockets or something. So maybe his attention would be better diverted there instead of like adding features to Twitter. But he doesn't seem to be able to like leave things be when he sort of sees a problem. He's kind of.
I think that he sees the failure. We're diverging a little bit from the topic, but I think he sees the failure of political conversation in America in particular to be an existential threat to the future of humanity. And I think that's something that is understated and underestimated by people.
But there are other people who could potentially do this. He wants to be focused.
Yeah, but they
on
won't.
Mars.
But that's your point. That's what people who could do it. Jack Dorsey's a very talented guy, and he didn't do it.
Wasn't he like off wandering the desert or something? And
he was the CEO of Twitter, and he didn't get it done. And we found out from the Twitter files that they were doing stuff behind his back, and he wasn't able to run things well. And Elon's come in, and I think, is Elon correct that the failure to have good political conversation is an existential threat to humanity? I think he might be pushing things a little bit there. But, I try not to underestimate Elon. If he thinks something, there's a good chance he's right.
Probably yes. But as I said, I think I would be happier to see him focused on Mars.
Well, you and I both. Well, we want to. I want to see him grow Tesla and grow SpaceX to the point that he has enough funds that he can afford to make Mars happen without government.
I think Tesla at this point has essentially won because, if you look at all the other car makers, I drive a Hyundai EV, which is, I like it, it's great. And that car probably wouldn't exist if it wasn't for Tesla.
Right.
So by essentially forcing the hand of everybody else, Tesla's main mission is accomplished. I think if he just walked away from Tesla now, Tesla would still be fine.
Yes, but
whereas Mars, I think, is something that would benefit from his direct attention more than it.
See, I think TeslaBot is essential to the Mars mission and to space in general, because on Earth we can kind of imagine a 1-to-1 ratio that everybody has their own bot. But on Mars or the moon, we might want a 10-to-1 ratio where the average individual has 10 bots. And you're able to, because humans can't walk on the surface of Mars without spacesuits and complications, but we'll be able to have bots acting on the surface of Mars without having to be wearing spacesuits.
Yeah.
And
I agree with that.
And they'll be able to accomplish, if you want to build an array of solar panels to generate methalox so that you can fly back to Earth, having training the bots to lay out an array of solar panels is a pretty good idea. And although the bots aren't going to be as strong as humans on Mars, they'll be 3 times as strong. The gravity is 1/3. They'll be able to do more, and they won't lose strength due to the lack of gravity.
True. They may have other problems though. They'll probably be all right on Mars, I think, because we've had machines driving around on Mars for like a decade and still working.
Yeah.
The moon I'd be a little more worried about, because the moon, I think even by the end of the later Apollo missions, the moon rovers had started to break down after like a day or two because the
radiation
environment. No, it's
or
the
dust.
Yeah, it's like horrible, sort of like electrostatically clingy, sort of very abrasive dust.
Right.
And also there's huge temperature variations on the moon because you're either in direct sunlight and you're like baking, or you're in shade and the temperature will like drop hundreds of degrees.
Right. Well, let's focus on Mars though. So the first thing I wanted to talk to you about, and this, I think the thing you and I had talked about a while ago, and I finally got you to talk about this on my channel, is how we get to Mars. And the simplest way that I understand is Starship is launched into orbit several times, and there's a fuel depot. Maybe that's like 2 starships together. It's just 1 starship, and you fill the fuel depot with as much liquid methane and liquid oxygen as possible, and then you launch the starship that has the human passengers on it, or the cargo that's going to go to Mars, and that docks with the propellant depot, fills up with fuel, and once the starship is in low Earth orbit, it's going to have enough fuel to be able to get to Mars.
Yeah, that's the mission.
And then there's, I think the most common version of the mission is you wait until Mars is in the right position, and then you start heading towards Mars, and it takes about 6 months to get there.
Depends. It's you can essentially change the amount of fuel you spend to change the delta V the sort of change in velocity that you achieve, and you can vary your trip time to for realistic fuel loads. It can be 4 months if you want.
I mean, I think there's even a theory that you could get there in 3 months, but somewhere between 3 and 6 months to get there, depending on how you do the mission. And that's just sort of like you're just flying to Mars from Earth when the planets are aligned roughly appropriately and you're able to make it work. But so that's one approach, somewhere in that scope. And then there's another approach, which I think you enlightened me about, and I was going to ask you to enlighten the audience about. There's something called the Mars Cycler, and I think it's named after one of the astronauts. What?
Yes. The cycler is there's several classes of cycler, but the one I'm interested in is the Aldrin cycle, after Buzz Aldrin, who sort of proposed this idea. What you do is, when you're transferring from Earth to Mars, so Earth and Mars are on nearly circular orbits. Mars is a bit more elliptical than ours, but they're still, you can think of them as roughly circular. You enter what's called a transfer orbit. So this is an ellipse that intersects your starting point and Mars, or where Mars will be when you arrive there. But the idea of the cycler is that you pick an ellipse such that when it goes around and it crosses Earth's orbit again, it will meet Earth at a later point in Earth's orbit. Excuse me. And what you can do then is you can do what's called a gravity assist, where you use the gravity of the Earth to apply a velocity vector to your spacecraft, and use this to rotate that elliptical orbit so that it's now aligned with the position where Earth and Mars are in relative to each other, because they'll have moved around. And then from there, you can just keep going forever. You need to do small adjustments, but once you've actually got on that cycle, you're not having to spend the same kind of fuel you are to do a burn to the transfer orbit each time. You're essentially getting a free transfer every 26 months.
Right. So just to be clear, this is the cycler is orbiting the sun.
Yes.
But not in the same, like if this is the sun and Earth and Mars are sort of orbiting in this plane, the cycler is coming above the plane or something like that?
No, it's sort of in the plane of Earth, because that's where it's got to go. So, but sorry,
the idea is it gets from Earth to Mars quickly in say 3 months or something.
But then 5 months.
But then like the trip back actually might take 20 months or something.
It's 5 months out, 21 months back to Earth.
Right. So you might make one cycler that has a short trip to Mars and then a long trip back.
You can do the other way around. Yeah, you can do one that's trip back and then.
So the point is when you have people going to Mars, they take the short version of the trip on the cycler that has a short trip between Earth and Mars, and then the cycler returns to Earth empty on the long way back, and you have a second cycler that makes the trip from Mars to Earth quickly and has a long way back to get to Mars.
Yeah. So essentially, you put space stations on these cycling orbits, and because you're not having to boost the mass of them every time you go, you can sort of build up the mass of them over time. You can make them quite big, because obviously, if you're going to be in space for 5 months, you want some room to move around. You want you ideally want quite a lot of radiation shielding, because the radiation in space is not sort of like lethal, as some people sort of seem to think, but it will increase your risk of developing cancer later in life if you're exposed to a lot of it. So we do want to minimize that. And also, if you want to build, if you want to mitigate the effects of zero gravity, you want to travel from Earth to Mars in like a big rotating structure. The size of these structures so they can spin and produce gravity without spinning so fast that they like make you nauseous. They'll be very massive, and you don't have to accelerate that to Mars every time you go. So you have one of these things going around the cycle orbit, And when you launch your Starship from Mars, from Earth, instead of going straight on a transfer to Mars, you visit the space station, you stay there for 5 months, and then the other end you depart, and you land as you would normally do with the Starship.
Now, so the Starship from Earth has to accelerate to match the orbit of the cycler.
Yes.
Why isn't that the same as accelerating to get to Mars?
It more or less is, but remember, when you've go to the regular Mars trip, you've got to take everything with you. So you've got to have a Starship that can accommodate however many people for 5 months, and that's going to limit your crew. You need all your food or whatever equipment you need to recycle waste into water, and so on. If you do it this way, you have the option of moving all that stuff to the cycler. So if your Starship only needs to take on people for like a couple of days or something, or however long it takes to intercept the cycler, then you can put more people on the Starship. So you're essentially avoiding paying for the extra payload mass you have to take with you.
And so ultimately the theory is if we'll be able to deliver larger volumes of cargo and larger numbers of people to Mars more cost effectively if the cycler can be set up to work the way we think it needs to work.
It doesn't really get the cargo price down. It just means you don't have to take as much with you for the journey. The idea is, if you've got to send a person to Mars, you've got the sort of like $100 per kilogram to low Earth orbit, or $500 per kilogram to Mars. Then, and for starters, you've got to accelerate your own body. You've got to accelerate whatever spacecraft you live in. You've got to accelerate your supplies and things. The idea is to minimize what you have to accelerate per person. So with a cycler, that's basically the optimal way of doing that.
But at some point, we have to accelerate the cycler to get it into the orbit it needs to be in.
Yeah, but you can keep using it. Once it's accelerated to orbit, you can keep using it. And also, you don't necessarily have to get all the cycler materials from Earth. You could maybe find asteroids or things and move the materials from them.
Or you could mine it from Mars, and Mars has a smaller gravity well, so it's easier to get materials into space from Mars. So the idea would be, we would establish the beginnings of a colony on Mars. And at some point, we would have enough people on Mars and enough material on Mars that we would be able to Mars would be able to meaningfully contribute to helping establish the cycler.
Yes, I mean, you can still, Earth can contribute as well, because I said, even if you imagine if you just put a regular Starship on the cycler orbit, then the next time you send a Starship out, it could dock with that and you just double the living space. There was a show on Netflix that had a Mars cycler as a sort of a.
Was that feature. The Expanse?
No, it was a film. Sorry, it was a Netflix film. I think it was called like Castaway or something. It was a Stowaway. Stowaway. That was it. They had some guy stowaway on a Mars mission, and they were using a Mars cycler, although theirs was pretty small. What I have in mind is sort of built up over time a fairly large space habitat that would rotate for gravity and have a decent amount of radiation shielding.
Right. Okay. And what we're looking toward, there's this vision. I think we've got this idea down about cyclers versus regular launches. And there's this vision about humanity going to Mars and building a colony of 1 million people. And ideally, that colony gets to the point where it's growing on its own, that people are having children, and we have something like 8 billion people on Earth. So you would only need 1 in 8,000 who are willing to go and fund it, whether Elon's funding it or the governments are funding it or they're funding themselves. It seems like 1 in 8,000 is attainable. Like, one of the challenges I wonder about is how hard is it going to be to get 1 million people willing to go? Because, if you think about it, people came from Europe to North America, and that was a pretty arduous trip, and a lot of people died, and there, was not very hospitable. And our technology is so advanced that it actually seems like traveling to Mars would be easier than when my ancestors, I should say, came to North America from Europe.
Yeah.
Right.
One of the things that caused the sort of population of the US to increase was a very high birth rate as well. I think that in the 19th century, it was the fertility rate was incredibly, it's like 8 or something,
Right?
Like absurd by modern standards.
The average woman had 8 children. Yes.
Yeah, so you probably don't want to replicate that straight up. Female colonists might object to that idea, so I think you would have to rely to a fair degree on getting people to volunteer from Earth to go to Mars, and it would probably grow quite a bit more slowly than.
Right. Well, but in order to be self-sustaining, the average woman on Mars would have to have 2 children or more.
Yep.
And so that takes me to a question that you and I talked about. We know that humans in low Earth orbit with effectively 0G or microgravity, that our bodies don't hold up that well. We've had humans on the moon, which has 10% of Earth's gravity, which is much more than low Earth orbit, but they weren't there for very long, so we didn't learn that much about humans being in low gravity for long periods. Mars has 0.38 or a bit more than 1/3 of Earth's gravity. We don't know how humans will react to living in 0.38 Gs. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Well, this essentially is, in my mind, the only question that we definitely can't answer yet. We don't really have a clue about. There's lots of sort of reasons to object to Mars colonization. They tend to be, people throw problems as if they can't possibly have a solution, and most of the time they do. Stuff like the cosmic radiation, the chemicals in the soil, these are things we can deal with. The gravity is the hard one. If it turns out that humans can't thrive and reproduce in 0.38 gravity, there may be a problem with the whole. We might have to sort of rethink how we're doing space. So in terms of the scientific evidence, as I said, we know what happens to people in 1G, we know what happens in 0G, and it's pretty bad. And we don't know what happens in between. And for some reason, this experiment hasn't been done in low Earth orbit, because we could do it if we got like a spacecraft, tethered it to a counterweight, and then had it tumble over end over end to create artificial gravity, or something similar to that, or maybe like a wheels type space station. We could spin it at the right speed to produce Martian gravity, send people there for like a year, send several generations of lab animals. Like we could, because mice live for like about a year or whatever, and you could do like 3-4 generations of mice and see what happens. And we haven't done that. So the worst case scenario is that people living in 0.38 gravity they lose all their bone and muscle mass, they have loads of medical problems, and that they can't have children. I think that's unlikely that it's going to be that bad. There may be some effects, but I think something's worth bearing in mind is that sort of the theory is, you're not going to be able to stay healthy in 0.38 gravity without constantly exercising. Well, we can't stay healthy in 1 gravity without some exercise. So
I went to the gym this morning, so
I have not, unfortunately. So yeah, I should definitely exercise more in 1 gravity. But I wonder if sort of when we find out like the sliding scale of effects between 0 and 1 gravity, if there's going to be an overlap with the impacts of sedentary lifestyles on Earth that we know about. So people spend too long sitting, they spend too long lying down, and they don't move about enough. And they end up developing diseases because of this. So I wonder if it might be that you just have to lead a more active lifestyle on Mars to stay healthy. It's just a similar situation to being on Earth, but it's even harsher if you neglect exercise.
Right. And just to be clear, one of the alternatives that Jeff Bezos has made more popular is what's called ONeill colonies, which is you basically just build a really large, like very, very, very large space colony that is in orbit of the Earth or somewhere in orbiting the sun or orbiting Mars, and it's rotating, and it basically creates 1G through its rotation. And Elon seems to like the Mars idea better. And
the reason, if you look at, I've read The High Frontier by Gerard ONeill, and I recommend it. It's a good book, and he lays out his ideas. And other people have developed them since as well, including Jeff Bezos. But the issue is, if you want to build an ONeill cylinder, the smallest designs are in the ballpark of millions of tons. So launching this from Earth is prohibitively expensive. So the plan has always been, right from when he started developing this concept in the 70s, is that you go to the moon first, typically, maybe to an asteroid. You set up a mining operation. You start getting the materials out, and you build an electromagnetic catapult. So on the moon, if you want to get stuff off the moon, you don't necessarily need to use a rocket. You can essentially have this sort of catapult is like a series of coils that sort of just you sort of pull some magnetism to accelerate sort of a metal bucket full of the material you want to get off the surface, and you can just accelerate to escape velocity along the ground because there's no atmosphere to worry about, and then it just flies off the end and goes into space. So ONeill wanted to build one of these on the surface of the moon, and he and his students, they did build some prototypes on the ground, some short length ones to show that it worked. So you have to go to the moon, you have to build the mining facilities, you have to build the catapult, and then you can start sending materials off to the site where you want to build this ONeill cylinder, and then you have to start constructing this giant sort of millions of ton this steel cylinder. I think the sort of canonical ONeill cylinder, I believe, was 8 kilometers in diameter and 32 long. I'm sure that sounds about right. So this absolutely huge object. Whereas with Mars, if you want to build a base on the surface of Mars, you just send a base to the surface of Mars and you're there.
Right.
If you go back to Mars Direct, this proposal about 1990 that Robert Zubrin did, and he's one of the ones who inspired Elon Musk to do this undertaking. The Mars Direct mission profile, it's basically said you could get people sort of, well, not living on Mars permanently, but on Mars for like 18 months for a single mission with 2 rockets the size of the SLS that just launched Artemis. We need a bigger upper stage, but basically that kind of rocket. It was just 2 launches from that. In terms of building ONeill cylinders, you would have to launch hundreds of rockets that size at least, just to sort of bootstrap the mining facilities and all that before you could even think about building the colony. So even though I think because you can just do more with these ONeill cylinders in terms of capturing the sun's output and creating spaces for people which are nice, I think long term those are the way to go. But we're not there yet. We need to start on planets first. If it's Mars or the moon, we need to sort of go somewhere where there's materials to work with, there's already some gravity, and then we can start building up, and then we can think about the ONeill colonies.
Right. So one of my concerns was not just that humans would have trouble, they would lose muscle mass on Mars or whatever, but that there's this process we go about having children, which is we have fun, and then an egg gets fertilized, and then the egg gestates. It becomes a fetus and an embryo and a fetus, and it spends 9 or 10 months inside the woman's womb and gets to a certain point where it's now a baby and comes out. And one of the things we don't know how humans will fare in low gravity. And I love your idea for the experiment. I'm surprised we haven't done that yet. And maybe Elon will push to do that experiment. But if it turns out that there's some moment in the process from fertilization to birth where the baby doesn't develop properly without 1G, then that's a huge problem.
Yeah.
And I had suggested to you, I mean, I made a video about this a while ago, that maybe you could create artificial gravity on the moon or Mars by using the boring company. It doesn't have to be tunnels, but the vision I have for it is it's in tunnels because the tunnels have the added benefit of protecting you from radiation because you're underground.
Yeah.
And then you could run basically trains in these tunnels running at the right speed so that people inside the tunnels in these trains would be living in 1G while they're on the train. And, it's on 8-hour shifts, and every 8 hours the train stops and whoever needs to get off gets off and whoever wants to get on gets on. And maybe you spend 8 hours a day on the train and that gives you enough to retain your muscle mass. Or maybe you need to maybe you sleep on it. Right. And then if a woman gets pregnant and you're able to determine through science, this is the particular window where the baby is going to need 1G, she stays in the train for a couple of weeks while you're going through that critical phase in the baby's development. And maybe it's longer.
Yeah. I'm watching a video. It's an interesting concept. This has been sort of a few proposals like this, but basically the idea is in free space you can just spin a cylinder and you stick to the outside and you've got how much gravity you want. On Mars or on another planet you can then have a spinning thing parallel to the surface, and then you have an angled floor so that the resultant force of the centrifugal force and the gravity adds up to your 1G that you want. I think for this kind of design, I always sort of envisaged something more like a roulette wheel, although obviously with steeper sides, because you would not have to stop that. You'd be able to, if you sort of went up to the middle of that, the tangential velocity would be fairly small because it'd only be rotating a couple of times a minute. So you'd literally be able to step off it. It'd be like stepping on and off a paternoster or something. No problem. So also something I know in your video, I took some notes actually. I'm just going to bring them up. A couple of good things.
Just really quick for those who are watching, when I made that video, I got one calculation wrong, and the number of tunnels needed to support the population size would be about 10x what I thought when I first made it. I overestimated the volume of usable space in the trains.
Right, well, a couple of things. I thought there were some good things about this idea. I mean, the use of boring company tubes. I think boring machines like that will be a key feature. I am not sure if the same ones will work on Mars because the ground is like very dry. It's like frozen solid. It's I don't know how well they work without air, but I assume they can be adapted somehow. So yeah, there'll definitely be tunnels, I think. When I submitted to a Mars Society competition, a design for a Martian city-state, it did feature a bunch of 4-meter tunnels for this reason. To an extent, it's a simpler problem than a free-floating habitat because you don't have to worry about lots of weird issues with angular momentum and stability and things because you're attached to the ground. So the planet itself, if you have free-floating habitats, there's due to conservation of angular momentum, you've got to have like a counter-rotating bit, and the shape of the habitat. If you get the sort of axes of the moment of inertia wrong, you can build it so it's unstable and it'll just randomly flip. But you don't have any of those problems if you're on the ground, because you've got sort of the planet as an angular momentum sink. And you could build this on Earth to test it fairly easily, where you can't, rotating space habitats, you can't really build them on Earth to test them. The issues I took with it is that I think you're making the circle too big. You aim for 2 RPM. This is something I'd see as a component of a fairly early Mars base. So you're going to have astronauts there mostly, and people who are, I think you could push them to higher RPMs. And because the acceleration is related to the square of the RPM.
Let me just explain this for the audience. So the idea is you have a circular tunnel and the train is going around, and because you're getting centrifugal force or centripetal force pressing, as it goes around the tunnel, you're getting pushed against the walls of the train, where you have the train banked, so you're actually being pushed against the floor of the train, and you're adding that to the 0.38 Gs of Mars, and so you go to a certain velocity and you're and a certain diameter of tunnel, and that gets you to roughly 1 G. And if you make the tunnel smaller, you have to go faster.
Yeah.
If you make the tunnel wider, or you have to go around more frequently, you have to increase the nerve.
Higher angular velocity.
If you make the tunnel wider, then I think you don't have to go around as often.
Yeah, I mean, if you go up to 4 RPM, you get down to, you had a 200 meter radius at 2 RPM, so you get a 50 meter radius at 4 RPM.
Yeah.
8, I think you can adapt to 8 RPM, and that would take you down to like a 13 meter radius. And I think you're pushing the turning circle of the boring machine at that point.
Yeah. Well, it's also if you have higher RPMs in a tighter tunnel, at some point it gets very uncomfortable for the humans in the loop.
I mean, the experiments they've done on Earth with spinning rooms, I mean, they've been fairly small. I mean, they've only been a few meters long radius, maybe 10 meters, I think, something like that. And they found people can adapt to them. So, yeah, I mean, if you've got the boring machine there, you may as well build a bigger tunnel, I guess. But like I said, I don't think you need to go to 200 meter radius to try this. The other thing I picked up on was that you had the tube being evacuated. I think that when you start thinking about Mars bases, I don't think you want people going in and out of the pressure volume very often. The way I think about it is, we don't use pressure doors in like our everyday life, right? You're not going to build a Mars base where you've got your own pressurized dome for a house and one for your work. So every morning you go out of an airlock, put a spacesuit on, cycle the airlock, walk across the surface, go to another building, repeat the process. You're not going to do an EVA to go to work every day. You're going to do it inside the pressurized volume. And the way I think about it is the only time we go through any kind of pressurized hatch, most of us in our lives, is when we board an airplane.
Right.
And I think that you can reasonably expect you want to design Mars colonies so that you do that with a comparable frequency. So you only have to do this as often as you would board an airplane.
So a lot of the Mars habitat would be connected, all under the same pressure seal, rather than having to go from one place. That makes sense.
I mean, EVAs, this is partly due to zero gravity, but EVAs are big deals on the space station.
Right.
It's not sort of like, I'm just going to pop outside for 5 minutes.
Okay.
And also you want to, because of you want to separate the Martian environment to an extent from the internal environment of the colony. There are some concerns about planetary protection, about sort of like, we won't be able to find life on Mars if we accidentally bring it with us. I'm in sort of two minds about that. You don't, if the scientists say this place is a really interesting site, like, don't build your colony right on top of it, I think we should maybe listen. It's a big planet.
Yeah.
But when they say the entire planet is off limits until we've cleared it, yeah, be reasonable.
That's not a terribly reasonable expectation.
Yeah.
And
But
there's material landing on Mars all the time from the cosmos and even from Earth.
Yeah. But yeah, the other reason to separate from the Martian environment is because, I mean, I alluded to this earlier, that there's some elements in the soil, notably the perchlorate, that you don't want inside because it's poisonous. It's a fairly soluble ion that, as I understand it, I'm not medically trained, so as I best understand it, it disrupts your thyroid function. And what you don't want is people treading this into their habitat, getting into your farming areas and then getting into your food.
Right.
That should be fairly easy to mitigate against. You just have to have the right procedures coming in and out of the airline. But sort of the upshot of that is you don't want to be doing this every day. You want to be going outside for a purpose and then carefully coming back in and like washing your boots and everything.
Okay. So are you excited that we're getting closer to going to Mars?
Yeah. Essentially, this is why I started the newsletter. I mean, I when I was a kid, I had all the books about space colonization. I was born in 81. So, but because we tended to buy books that the library was throwing away, because they have like the secondhand store. The space books I had were a bit dated. So like late 80s, I was reading sort of late 70s and early 80s space books, which pre-Challenger were a lot more gung-ho about space colonization. So I had books that had like pictures of space shuttles, like the original American space shuttle building something that looked like an ONeill cylinder, which might sort of seem ridiculous today, but people did think that the space shuttle was going to revolutionize things in that way. So I grew up on this stuff, but I kind of sort of put it aside as I kind of went into adulthood, because I thought this isn't happening anytime soon. I need to sort of like be realistic. And it was only sort of SpaceX that brought me back to this. It was literally December 2015, the first time they landed the booster on land.
December 21, 2015, a date that should be a global holiday.
Yeah, because I when early SpaceX, I didn't pay much attention to, because I mean I didn't even know who Elon Musk was. I first heard about him when I was hearing about SpaceX, and it's like, oh, this guy's tech billionaire comes along, he thinks he can do rockets better than NASA. The first 3 he launches explode or fall into the sea. And that sort of, if you don't know any of the details, that just seems like a typical story of, hubris, billionaire thinks he knows it all, and turns out it is rocket science. But by the time he gets to like landing that first Falcon 9, I realized that this company, this guy, they're actually going to change things. They're going to be revolutionary, and this is something that's going to start happening now in my lifetime. And that's when I started seriously paying attention to it.
So would you go? If
myself?
Yes.
That's completely dependent on my family, because I have 2 small children. I'm not going to bugger off to another planet and leave them here. I don't think my wife really wants to go either. I think if I was single and 20, I would go in a heartbeat.
Yeah. I have 2 young adult children, and just to convey to people why I probably wouldn't go to Mars, sometimes I think I'd change my mind on this. If you go to the moon, let's say, I would go to the moon in a heartbeat. You can go to the moon, it might be a 1-week trip, maybe 2 weeks, and then you're back home. And your communication from the moon to Earth is fairly quick. Like there's a lag, on a Zoom call or something like that, the lag might be a second each way.
So, it's about 3 seconds total. It's about
3 seconds. So if you go to Mars, you're not coming home for 30 months. 2.5 years, roughly.
That's actually part of the appeal of it, I think. Because it's kind of like
Well, not a
the explorer guy who burnt his ships. What was his name? I can't remember. One of the early sort of American explorers of the Americas burnt his own ships apparently to sort of say, right, we're doing this, we're here to stay.
right. But because I have children, I would like to be able to communicate with them, and I would like to be able to see them and hug them, and not being able to see them in person and hug them for 30 months would be kind of an ordeal. And then the communication, the latency, the length of a time it takes for let's say you're sending a message to them is anywhere from 4 to 20 minutes, I think is roughly the time to go one way. So you can't even have an ordinary phone conversation. The best you can do is basically sending each other emails and maybe video clips, but you can't have real-time interaction. So being separated from my children for that long would be quite an ordeal. So I can see your point. If you were single, then of course you'd be separated from your parents and your friends and your family.
I don't know, but a lot of people, when they're that age, they really want to be separated from their parents for a while.
I'm pretty sure my youngest child wants to be a separate. My kids they're adults. They're young adults, and they're very independent. And when they're kids, they want a lot of your time. When they're adults, they want an hour a week, maybe.
Yeah.
One of them, I think, wants about 5 minutes a week, and she's good.
This sort of leads on to another thing, is that you're not going to colonize Mars with astronauts.
You got to get regular people to go.
Yeah, and well, specifically because if you think like who becomes an astronaut, right? These are people who essentially have already succeeded in like multiple axes of life. They're like they've got like graduate degrees, they've had good careers, they maybe have like had like a military career as well, and they're typically they have families. They're like very successful people on Earth to even like consider being like getting into one of the astronaut programs. So the space agencies are selecting for people who have a lot of reason to like being on Earth. So you've got the kind of people who would go to Mars are people who sort of think that life would be better for them there. So if you think life is going to be better for you on Mars, even though knowing it'll be very, very hard, it's probably someone who doesn't have a lot of opportunities necessarily here.
Well, I guess the theory is if you got to Mars and you opened the first pizza restaurant, right? If you got in early on and you bought land and you got control of a chunk of land, if Mars is going to become a going concern, if it's going to become a thriving and growing colony, then getting there early is a good idea.
Yeah.
And
so it'd be the kind of people who do startups, I guess. And
also there's an adventure side to it that's like, somebody who'd climb Mount Everest. That's actually quite a trip to go climb Mount Everest. I think that's months. But
on the other hand, that tends to be also rich people, because I think it costs like £50,000 or something. An Everest trip is not cheap.
Right. But if you look at the people who came to North America from Europe in the early waves, it was people who didn't have much prospects in Europe. And there were opportunities to come to America and make something of yourself. What?
They were weird religious misfits originally, weren't they?
Right. You had the religious but whatever, you fled Europe where life was nasty, brutish, and short, for lack of a better term, and you came to America where life was nasty, brutish, and short, but there was hope for the future.
Yes, this is one sort of something I'm going to be writing about on the newsletter. I've kind of half drafted this, is to work out what the actual market for Mars travel is. It's not really anything to compare it with, but I figured that you're looking for how many people will pay how much to go to another planet. And nobody's, apart from like the Apollo astronauts, which don't really count, nobody's ever done this before. So the way I start thinking about it is that if you sort of consider, I'm not sure how to phrase it, but like if you look at sort of the very sort of unequal societies we sort of increasingly live in, is that there's some fairly sharp divides. You're either on one side or the other, like your you're a homeowner or you're renting, you're rich or poor, and you could sort of satirically think of these as two separate planets occupying the same space. And then figure, well, people want to get from the crappy planet to the good planet. Like, what will they do to get there? And
Yeah.
you start thinking about things. Well, one thing is education. If you can get your kids into a good university, get them a good job, and they meet the right people, so you look at how much people pay for that. And I mean, I know it's a lot more expensive in the US. I imagine that there's going to be a point when the price of going to Mars becomes cheaper than the price of going to a top university there. And it might be that
That's already true. The price of going to a top university is already, $70,000 a year times 4 years. It's almost $300,000. 75,000, maybe $300,000 total for 4 years.
Yeah, so it's not Elon Musk doing all the work there.
But I would say this: parents are not going to want to spend that money to send their kid to Mars. But I think that to get 1 million people to go there, a lot of them won't be able to afford it and won't be willing to spend it. But I think Elon is going to be wealthy enough. I picture Tesla becoming a $10+ trillion company and Elon owning 20%. That'll be $2 trillion in net worth. And SpaceX is probably going to be a $5 trillion company, and Elon, I think, might own half of SpaceX. So there's another 2 trillion. And then I think Neuralink and Boring Company are going to become multi-trillion-dollar companies. And so Elon's net worth might be 5 or 10 trillion by the time we're really ready to send a lot of people to Mars in volume. And I think he might just write the check.
Possibly. Although going back to the cycler thing, I think it's possible to get lower than Elon's price by doing these more complex architecture. So the idea of the cycler is you're just you're traveling with as minimal stuff as you can, just yourself and some basic hand luggage. And that could get really the price down quite a lot. I'm thinking sort of maybe tens of thousands will be possible.
Okay.
And I think definitely just sort of instead of just going to Mars straight, if you could get people to a colony in Earth orbit. So if you can get there in like an hour or two on a Starship or a couple of hours, you could then like lay that out inside more like an airliner than a cruise ship, and you could pick hundreds and hundreds of people. Starship is massive, so I think you could probably fit like 500 people in that thing, something like that, and then you get to the point where it's only a few thousand to get to low Earth orbit,
right?
And so you don't necessarily have to have everyone going to Mars to like find opportunities.
Well, one of the things that Elon talked about, I think it was 2019. This is the inspiration for my first video when I started making videos about Tesla and SpaceX, was a SpaceX video. Elon had tweeted something about the next generation Starship would be 18 meters in diameter. And I think he's backed off of that idea. I think he's determined that the gain from going to 9 meters to like even 9 meters might have been bigger than they needed, but the gain from going 9 meters to 18 meters in diameter, which, sorry for everybody else, that's like 30 feet in diameter versus 60 feet in diameter, roughly. I think he's backed off and decided that's not necessary. The gain isn't that great. Do you have any thoughts on that? Is there a prospect for a larger Starship?
I mean, they could build one. I'm not sure exactly what sort of calculation he's making there. But he tends to sort of think out loud, so it's difficult to sort of say if that's a definite like SpaceX policy that they are going to build this.
Oh, I think he backed off it and he said they're not going to do it now. But you never know what he means by that.
Yeah. Well, I mean, he could back onto it again. He will pivot very rapidly when they discover something new. Like if you recall, there was Starship was originally going to be made out of carbon fiber.
Yes.
And SpaceX had bought a 9-meter mandrel, so like a
I remember that
bobbin kind of thing. And they had this photo, this massive like wheel sort of bobbin thingy next to a parked Tesla, and it's like 9 meters across that it made specially. And then they switched to stainless steel. They had this thing like scrapped. They paid like millions and millions of dollars to have this made specially, but rather than sort of get trapped in the sunk cost when they didn't need it anymore, okay, scrap metal.
They should have sold it to Blue Origin. All right, so are there any other? We've talked about getting to Mars. I think we've sort of roughly touched on getting home from Mars. We've talked about Mars. Is there any other challenges in establishing a colony on Mars we haven't covered that you think are a big deal?
Well, once you're there, you're going to need food and you're going to need water and clothing, all the other things to sort of like live a normal life. Now, transporting them from Earth will be expensive. If you just sort of look at the things you buy normally and just add $500 per kilogram to them, like this can I'm drinking, this is 330 milliliters, so a third of a kilogram basically. So that would be that'll be $166 for that. If I had that imported from, that's even at like very low Starship.
That's a heck of a Coke.
So you've really got to sort of think very sort of straight away as you get there. It's like, how can we use the materials here to build what we need?
Right.
And do you remember Biosphere 2?
Yes.
It was in the early 90s. That was a bit of this was an attempt to sort of like have a completely closed biosphere. So like all the waste products would get recycled. So the carbon dioxide and toilet waste, all that would just get recycled into this sort of controlled ecosystem, and that it would just produce everything they need. And it didn't work very well. So this is still a challenge. A lot of people sort of jump on that and say, oh, this is proof it'll never work. That's a bit of an exaggeration. But we definitely need to look into this called bioregenerative life support.
Right.
The Chinese are doing experiments on this. They have this thing called Lunar Palace, which is sort of like a similar sort of thing. The Russians did an experiment called BIOS 3. That was the most recent one. They did BIOS 1 and 2, but BIOS 3 was the main one. So this has been touched on, but Elon and SpaceX are very focused on just get the rocket working, get there, because if they can't get there, nothing else matters. And they will have enough lift capacity to just send enough supplies for the initial missions. But we do need to think very hard about making sure that you don't end up paying $166 for your drink.
Right.
And yeah, because there's not been much said about that from SpaceX. They've been pretty quiet on the actual supporting people on the surface of Mars.
Okay. Anything else you want to talk about? Anything else come to your mind with this conversation?
No, I think we've covered most of the things that are useful.
Okay. I appreciate, for those who don't realize, it's late in the UK. You're past 11. You're past 11 p.m., right?
It's 10:15.
Okay. Oh, you're 5 hours ahead, not 6.
Yeah.
I wanted to let you get back to your life. I wanted to thank you for coming on. I'm going to put links in the video description below for everybody watching. You'll be able to get links to Peter's Twitter account, and I guess Planetocracy would be a good link to have for you. Yeah. And please check out the t-shirts at elonbits.com. Please check out my other videos. Support me on Locals, Patreon, YouTube channel memberships. Is there anything they can support you on besides checking out Planetocracy?
No, the newsletter is free. I'm not actually collecting money from anybody at the moment. So there's just subscribe for free. I like subscribers.
And it's planetocracy.org or planetocracy.com or?
That's Substack.
Oh, it's planetocracy.substack.com.
Yeah.
Okay. So please check that out and check out the t-shirts at elonbits.com. Check out my other videos. Support me on Patreon, Locals. There's a YouTube channel member. Please like this video, share it, and subscribe. And let's go to Mars. Thank you,
Yep.
Peter, so much for coming on.